Hello. Before I present an essay that I wrote in the spring of 2022 for my second and last senior capstone course at Kennesaw State University, while I was obtaining my bachelor's degree in history, there are a few things that I would like to address. The first thing that I would like to mention is that while this essay was written in January through May of 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of that year had no bearing on the topic of my final capstone research course for my undergraduate degree. The course that I was taking, it was a course in European revolutions, and we were able to pick from 5 revolutions, one of them being the Russian revolutions of 1917. And my professor allowed me to, instead of discussing the Russian side of things, to focus on a periphery topic of the Russian Revolution. And I chose the Ukrainian Revolution and Ukrainian nationalism. So that being said, this essay was not meant to be a condemnation of the Russian invasion, nor blind support for Ukrainian nationalism at the time. It just so happens that world events were happening at the same time that I was writing this essay. That is not to say that I do not have opinions about the 4-year, 3-day special operation. I most certainly do, but that is not what this essay was about, at least from what I remember. It's been 4 years since I wrote it. But let's see. The essay was meant to explain the roots of Ukrainian nationalism and the evolution of it from the Kievan Rus through the collapse of the principalities and into the absorption by many different empires throughout the ages, and the ongoing evolution of a distinct Ukrainian identity when the Ukrainian people did not have a place that they could call their own. I would also like to address that I am not a professional historian nor a professional writer. While I do consider the fact that I spent 4 years obtaining a degree with a focus being the study of history, I do not consider myself to be a professional, nor professionally trained. I do enjoy the stories and lessons that history has to offer us. I constantly find myself listening to podcasts on YouTube, podcast or YouTube videos specifically about history if I'm seeking entertainment. Music often bores me, and I have not created the time to read in a year plus. So YouTube and podcasts tend to be how I get my entertainment. However, for me, podcasts and YouTube videos are easy to consume, and I would say about 95% of the videos or podcasts that I consume are related to history. So that being said, while I'm not an expert historian in any subject of history, I am constantly exposed to it and I find enjoyment from it. Also, while I consider my writing abilities to be on par with my peers in academia, sometimes my writing is better, and sometimes it is not as good. If my memory serves me correctly, I wrote this essay in about 36 hours because I procrastinated getting the final essay for the degree completed with the 4 months that I had to write it. So, if there are any glaring grammatical issues or problems with the flow of this essay, it probably has to do with the fact that I am not a professional writer and the essay was written in one go. If this essay left out any important information, it was because I was either unaware of the information, or I did not know how to fit it into the essay, or I did not believe it belonged in the essay. That being said, I am certain I left out a great deal of context and information from my essay. In my opinion, that is okay. I was 22 at the time. Right? No, I was 21 at the time. I was 21 at the time. I was an undergraduate. This was not a PhD thesis that was meant to be the foundation of higher writing. I'm not saying that writing bad history or history with a ulterior motive is okay. It's just that I understand this essay is not going to be perfect. So bear with me on that. I'm not claiming to be an expert in the field, nor an end all be all voice on this subject. There are most definitely a number of individuals that could pick my essay apart for one reason or another, and that is okay. I accept that there are going to be people that have different opinions, different viewpoints, or more knowledge about this subject than I possess. Lastly, I would like to provide a little bit of context as to why I'm deciding to upload this video essay after 4 years of having it in my computer. This morning, after a night of zero sleep for some reason, I saw a YouTuber that I enjoy watching. His channel goes by The History of Everything. And the most recent video that was uploaded this morning was about the history of Belarus. That I clicked on it to watch it while I was cooking some food. And it reminded me not only about the essay, not only about his other videos that he has. I think it's a 4-part video series on the history of Ukraine. But it reminded me of my own essay that I had. Plus, this gives me something to do instead of studying for the LSAT exam, which I should be taking in about 2 weeks. So I'm trying to stay somewhat productive despite my procrastination or distraction from what I need to do. I will be doing a voiceover reading my essay, so from here on out, you will be seeing the essay as it was submitted nearly 4 years ago. I have not changed it, and it is the unadulterated project which I completed my undergraduate degree with. The sources and references are going to be in Chicago, and there will be a work cited at the end of the essay. So whenever I do make claims, I do have the citations. It just may take you looking at the footnotes and then the work cited to see where I got those citations from. That being said, hopefully everybody watching enjoys the video. The Origins of Ukrainian Nationalism, a story of perseverance and modern triumph by Dylan Reynolds. Ukraine, a land of blue sky and yellow fields, a modern nation pressed between two worlds. The people who call the land of Ukraine home or consider themselves Ukrainian only in recent history can truly make such a claim. In the mid-19th century through 1921, a concept of Ukrainian nationalism emerged in the midst of multinational empires, a concept of nationalism that culminated in the establishment of various Ukrainian states in Eastern Europe. There were different eras of Ukrainian nationalism and a multitude of influences which shaped how Ukrainians viewed their own nationalism. The ultimate failure of the Ukrainian revolutions towards the end of the Civil War and the establishment of Poland did put a pause in the Ukrainian national movement. These Ukrainian nationalistic bodies did, however, lay the foundations for the modern and independent state of Ukraine, a nation where the ideas of nationalism from the past combined with those from the present and in a way resume where the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 through 1921 came to a halt. While Ukrainian nationalism ultimately failed to establish and build upon the foundations laid in the mid-19th and early 20th century, it was a critical moment for the Ukrainian national movement. The history of Ukraine is one which is complex and intertwined with multiple other histories. As a result, it is difficult to say exactly where Ukrainian nationalism where Ukrainians became a distinct ethnic group and Ukrainian nationalism took root. Many historians begin to chronicle the history of modern Ukraine in the 860s, when Prince Rurik founded his dynasty according to the tales of bygone years. There is a reason for this, of course, and that is that historians have in the past viewed the Kievan Rus as the precursor not only to Ukraine, but to Russia and Belarus. Though, as will be shown, this is a faulty era to begin to claim the origins of Ukrainian nationalism. In 1848, revolutions of nationalism and a desire for change swept through Central Europe. While the main events of the revolutions of 1848 did undoubtedly take place in Central Europe, change did make its way into Eastern Europe. In the region of Galicia, a province in Habsburg, Austria, a minority of Ukrainians experimented with creating a new Ukrainian identity. These Ukrainians in Galicia are considered to have laid the foundations for Ukrainian nationalism in the 20th century. Further expansion of nationalism occurred in 1906. At this time, Little Russians were granted limited freedom towards creating an identity separate from the Russians. These experiments with nationalism under the supervision of empires culminated in the Ukrainian revolutions, when both the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires collapsed in 1917 and 1918. A sense of nationalism developed into Ukrainian states. Ukrainians declared independence from empires and national states alike. Nationalism was seemingly leading towards a land for Ukrainians to call their own. The Ukrainian Revolution, however, was short-lived due to Ukrainian factionalism, Ukrainian political turmoil, foreign invasion, and the geopolitical situation of post-war Europe, Ukraine as a state, which failed to forge its own future. Over the next 70 years, Ukrainians and the lands of Ukraine were once again under the control of various entities. The USSR originally kept what the Russian Empire claimed. Poland received Galicia once again. When Germany invaded Poland and subsequently the USSR, it is possibly fair to put in a footnote here that I do believe that whenever the Soviet Union invaded Poland in conjunction with Nazi Germany under the treaty that they had with Molotov and Ribbentrop, that Galicia was brought underneath the USSR, but I do not have the sources for that at this moment. It is just speculation, but I do believe that is oversight on my part, because I do not believe that Germany invaded Poland that far during the initial invasion. But that side note aside, we will continue. Where are we? The USSR kept what the Russian Empire claimed. Poland received Galicia once again. When Germany invaded Poland and subsequently the USSR, Ukraine was brought under their influence. After World War II, Ukraine was once again claimed by the USSR. The foundations which had been laid in the 19th and early 20th century had, however, not been forgotten. The memory of the Ukrainian Revolution and the idea of independence, of an independent Ukraine, did become a reality with the Declaration of Ukrainian Independence in 1991. The historiography of Ukrainian history and or Ukrainian nationalism is a complex matter. There are works which positively focus on the topic of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity. These works, however, are typically associated with Ukrainian studies institutes, with a Ukrainian Study Institute or a professor of Ukrainian studies, leaving limited options outside of established institutions. An example of the limited options is Ukraine, A History by this gentleman, or Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont by this gentleman, both of which are insightful books into the era and elements of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity, but each come from the University of Toronto Press. On the other side of the spectrum is the discussion of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity to add to the larger discussion on the Ruski Mir. In this context, Ukrainian studies are typically briefly mentioned, as such mentions are seen to further advance the study of Russian history. Sometimes,
through mechanisms such as claiming ownership of the Kievan Rus as being Russian, other times through viewing Ukraine as a mere extension of Russia. These styles of historiography could be considered the traditional method for studying Ukrainian history, nationalism, or identity due to the centuries of those writing the histories of such topics coming from Russian intelligentsia or scholars. Examples of this would be works such as Civil War in South Russia, 1919 through 1920, The Defeat of the Whites, or A History of 20th Century Russia by Peter Kurtz and Robert Service, respectively. While there are deviations, outliers, and independent sources for the exploration of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity, the above mentioned trends are what is typical at this moment in time. There are, however, primary sources available which allow for the historiography to be expanded upon in ways which may have yet to be covered. Political documents from various factions within Ukraine during the revolution are available. Manifestos and declarations are available. Documents from the nationalists in the West, documents from the Central Rada in Kiev, to Bolsheviks and Ukrainian socialists can all be used to expand the available picture the historiography has painted. So while the historiography of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity is small compared to other histories, there is still ample opportunity to expand how we view these Ukrainian topics. While this essay is by no stretch of the imagination a professional piece of scholarly work, I do want to explore the roots of Ukrainian nationalism in a historical context through the use of documents created during the Russian Revolution, articles made available to me, and various books. I am striving to explore this topic, which not only interests me, but is also an important topic to understand given the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. 4 years later. Where did I stop off? This essay will be split into 3 sections. The first section is meant to be a brief survey of Ukrainian history, nationalism, identity up to 1848. While this section does not weigh heavily on my main field of research, it is important to have background information on Ukraine. The second and first main section will cover Ukrainian nationalism and the history of it in the face of the revolutions of 1848 and to 1917. The third section will cover Ukrainian nationalism during the Ukrainian Revolution. This section is meant to be the center point of my research. I intend to explore not only what Ukrainian nationalism meant during the 4 years of the revolution, but also how it fits in with the larger picture of the post-World War I period. I hope to provide some original insight into this topic through the use of documents from this period. By analyzing this aspect of European history, I seek to provide a different perspective on the discussion of nationalism, as well as provide insight into how the current situation in Ukraine developed. The origins of a Ukrainian state have traditionally been traced back to the foundation of the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was a medieval state founded by Prince Rurikh of Novgorod, a Norseman who settled in northern Russia. Through treachery and deception, Oleg of Novgorod seized the city of Kiev and declared that it should be, quote, declared that it should be the mother of Russian cities, end quote. Through conquest and diplomacy, the Varangians of the Rurikid dynasty came to control a large area of land. With this land came a plethora of tribes and people, a number of which were Slavs. The ruling Norse, who later became more and more Slavic as generations passed, were in contact with Constantinople, the Norse in Scandinavia, Arabs, and Western Europe. From this, they formed an impressive medieval state. though the stability of the state was constantly endangered due to infighting and outside threats. The medieval state of the Kievan Rus saw one of the first major divisions in the latter half of the 11th century. This gentleman notes in The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont, this divergence of control and influence can be traced back to the formation of the Rostislav dynasty. As grandson to Yaroslav the Wise, Prince Rostislav was tied to the heritage of Kiev, but his domain became distinct from the other lands of the Rus. Orest Stubtinly, in his works Ukrainian History, mentions that the region of Galicia under the Rostislav dynasty, became distinct enough to be the first of the Kievan Rus principalities to break away from Kiev. Though this independence was short-lived, after the Rostislav dynasty grew weak after only a handful of generations, the region was wrestled away by Roman the Great Mstislav when Galicia was merged with Volhynia in 1199. While the dynasty that Roman the Great established in West Ukraine did come to an end in 1340 with the assassination of Borislav of Mazovia, the region was plunged into a 52-year-long conflict which saw the lands being split between Poland and Lithuania. Despite the dissolution of a Kievan Rus principality, which lasted circa 100 years after the fall of the Kievan Rus, in the late 14th century, a distinct identity was formed during this period. As this gentleman puts it, this family, preserved for Ukrainians a sense of cultural and political distinctiveness. This distinctiveness would be of critical importance to their survival as a separate national entity in the difficult times yet to come. So, while a sense of Ukrainian nationalism may not directly come from the Kievan Rus state, it is still important to mention that this period does have lasting effects. By the dawning of the 15th century, the lands of Ukraine were no longer a state for Ukrainians. In the north, the Muscovite Principality was forming their own identity, further separating from the ancestral seat of power in Kiev. The Poles and Lithuanians were seizing land on the Ukrainian steppe, while the Mongols' Golden Horde was still situated in parts of Eastern Europe, including Ukrainian lands. In essence, the Slavs of Ukraine had become a stateless people and once again found themselves subject to other states. This gentleman, however, does argue in Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, this state of existence did not spell the end for Ukrainian identity. Between the eras of the Kievan Rus and the Cossack period, some Ruthenian elites did maintain a distinction from the Poles and Lithuanians. In 1649, a Cossack state called the Cossack Hetman was established after conflict with Poland. The autonomous Ukrainian Cossack state did not last, however. 55 years after signing this treaty, which placed the Tsar as protector of the Hetman, Russia defeated Sweden and Cossack forces, which saw Ukrainian autonomy decrease even more than it had in the years prior. The Cossack Hetman did carry on in the memory of Ukrainians living under Tsarist rule in later years, acting as a foundational piece to expand Ukrainian nationalism and identity in the 19th and 20th century. The period between 1848 and 1917 is an important era in the development of Ukrainian nationalism and identity. Considering the rise of nationalism amongst many groups within Europe at the time, Ukrainians soon found themselves experimenting with their own nationalism as well. In the spring of 1840, the spring of 1848 brought change to Ukrainian nationalism through larger changes which occurred in the Austrian Empire. Due to relaxed control after 1848, the Ukrainians in the region were able to begin experimenting with their own identities. In 1906, when the Tsarist government slightly relaxed the control over the Ukrainians, a similar experiment of Russian-Ukrainian nationalism took place. These experiments culminated in the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917, the event which took Ukrainian nationalism from an experiment to being a center point for a new nation. When Central Europe was rocked by the political chaos brought by the spring of 1848, the winds of change blew east into the Ukrainian province of Galicia. Since coming under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and later the Austrian Empire, Ukrainians remained a sizable minority in the region, yet being seen as a minority, they were allowed little voice which they could express national interest. In 1848, the Ukrainians were given an unlikely opportunity. The Austrian Empire not only allowed them to take nationalist action, but supported such action. Though still firmly under the control of the Habsburg Austria, the Ukrainians were allowed to become politically active, as well as allowed to build a Ruthenian intelligentsia. As a result of the turmoil caused by the revolutions of 1848, the Austrians sought to integrate Ukraine into the empire a little more than had been done in the past. The Ukrainians were allowed to form political bodies at this time, some of which were local political bodies. Some were able to represent Galician Ukrainians in the Reichstag. At this time, Ukrainian became a language which literature was being produced in. Social organizations were created with the goal of sponsoring a Ukrainian community. The Ukrainians were even able to have their own language and literature become an official field of study at the University of Lviv. All this is to say that the Ukrainians of Galicia were taking massive strides towards nationalism, strides that would be of great importance later down the road. This gentleman points out in his book, Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont, that following the spring of 1848, Ukrainians did become active within the Austrian government. After the founding of the Austrian parliament, Ukrainians from Galicia were made active members within the parliament. Through this involvement, Ukrainian political parties were formed. Political parties which, quote, declare that their ultimate goal was independent statehood, end quote. Ukrainians in Galicia were involved in the Galician Diet on multiple occasions, going toe-to-toe with the Polish population of Galicia in an attempt to secure increasing Ukrainian influence over the Ukrainian population and land. And Applebaum points out that the political expression of Ukrainians was successful enough that from 1899 onward, the Ukrainian National Democratic Party was able to operate and compete with the Poles freely. A party that did see limited success despite a system rigged in the favor of the Poles in Galicia. While the tangible achievements of Ukrainians in the political world are limited in regards to securing nationalist achievement, it is important to note that when working with the limited resources at their disposal, the Ukrainians were able to take a step towards forming a national identity through politics. Where the Ukrainians in Galicia made leaps and bounds in regards to nationalism was in the intellectual and communal aspect of life. Considering the Ukrainians had been a stateless people for 200 years at the very least, it is unfair to expect the Ukrainians to have been able to establish a state for themselves immediately after 1848. However, when the Habsburgs allowed nationalism to be experimented with in quote with in less quote politically influential end quote areas in Ukraine, pounced on the opportunity. Within a year and a half of the events of the spring of 1848, the Ukrainians in Galicia had published their own newspapers in Ukrainian. Ukrainians were soon publishing literary works in Ukrainian, teaching classes ranging from primary school to university in Ukrainian. The Ukrainians in Galicia were able to found social organizations which sought to educate the Ukrainian peasantry and form a sense of community with one another. By 1914, reaching levels of involvement that just one of these organizations, the Prosvita Society, had 77 branches, 3,000 reading rooms, and 360,000 members. Most importantly, a select number of Ukrainians became members of the intelligentsia. Though relatively small in number, the Galician intelligentsia would become the main champions of Ukrainian nationalism and would become the main champions of Ukrainian nationalism. The intelligentsia, made up mostly of members of the clergy and some educated Ukrainians, would experiment with what it meant to be Ukrainian. These intelligentsia experimented with concepts that would stimulate Ukrainians in the future, and to a degree, their experimentation with what it meant to be a Ukrainian national would be foundational for the Ukrainian nationals during the Ukrainian Revolution. Across the Galician border and within the bulk of what is now Ukraine, a different experiment with nationalism was occurring for the Ukrainians of the Tsar's land. The Ukrainians of the East arguably inherited a system steeped in aristocratic and feudalistic systems. A system where loyalty to the Tsar in St. Petersburg was seen as being nationalistic. A system where Ukrainians could be seen as being disloyal and anti-Russian if they attempted to express their own culture. In Russian Ukraine, instruments for nationalism such as schooling, language, and literature were limited because of Russification or social position of the Ukrainians. The power to implement political change was limited. Even the intelligentsia were not always safe to experiment with what it meant to be Ukrainian in Tsarist Russia. Despite the issues, the Ukrainians of Russia did take steps towards forming ideas of nationalism, ideas which did prove necessary for the Ukrainian Revolution. One issue with determining what it meant to be Ukrainian in the mid-19th century was that Ukraine had not had a state of its own for at least 200 years. Nearly 600 years if the fall of the Kievan Rus is used as the baseline for a Ukrainian state over the Cossacks of the 17th century. Because of this, there is an inherent reliance on soft factors for forming nationalism, such as schools, language, or literature to establish national identity. The issue with reliance on these soft factors is that they are inherently easier to control than a sense of nationalism that stems from belonging to an established nation. The Russian government did establish schools in Ukraine, but they were meant to serve a purpose for Russia rather than Ukrainians. This gentleman goes on to say in Ukraine, A Birth of a Modern Nation, that one such institution for learning, Kiev University, acted, quote, as a citadel of Russian schooling, end quote, in a land with a minority of Russians. When Ukrainian studies did take place, it was often amongst small circles of intelligentsia most of which were rarely of peasant origin, though studies of Ukrainian history did lay the foundation for Ukrainian nationalism within Russian Ukraine. This was mostly done to draw Ukrainians closer to Russia and act as a means to pull them away from the Polish or Austrian influence. language suffered through being seen as merely a dialect of Russian. And shortly after Ukrainian literature was being produced in Ukrainian, the Russian government began to crack down on the Ukrainian publication, began to crack down on the Ukrainians. Publications on Ukraine that were Ukrainophilic in nature were banned, and writers, publishers, or Ukrainian thinkers were not allowed to publish pro-Ukrainian works under the threat of job loss, arrest, or exile. This is not to say that under such circumstances, Ukrainian nationalism and identity did not form. This gentleman does state that during the first half of the 19th century, Eastern Ukrainians, quote, took its turn in playing the leading role in Ukrainian cultural development, end quote, showing that even when these factors came about in Tsarist Russia, there was still an effect on national identity. However, when compared to the West, these factors went through various stages of stability and did not appear to have been widespread compared to Galicia. Another aspect of Tsarist Russia was the political order of the day. Russia was a feudal state, technically until 1861, when Alexander II emancipated the serfs of his empire. Due to this being the situation, being a noble meant a great deal in achieving political success in Russia. Why did this present an issue for Ukrainians and prevent them from being involved politically? This is because the Ukrainians were seen as a nobleless people on account of no Ukrainian state having existed in 200 years or more. In the event that there was Ukrainian nobility, it was more likely than not that they would assimilate into Russian society. This means that in most regards, the leaders of Eastern Ukrainian national movements were the intelligentsia, most of whom were Ukrainian, however, some of which were Russian or Poles. One such group of intelligentsia was the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, a group of educated men who sought to lead Ukrainians towards a better future away from the clutches of the Russian Empire. Not surprisingly, the group was hunted down, disbanded, and members were charged with various crimes. However, due to the radical nature of their goals, the most prominent member, this gentleman, was exiled for 10 years to the Russian Far East and was prohibited from writing or drawing during his exile. On the other hand, there was the more successful Kiev Armada, a social group dedicated to the Ukrainian culture and mass enlightenment of the peasant population. An important development for this society was developing connections with Ukrainians in Galicia who were doing the same thing, albeit under different circumstances. Few events in history occur from thin air. Most often than not, there needs to be a series of events that lead up to the event in question. For the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 through 1921, these foundational events can firmly be traced back to the 19th century when Ukrainian nationalism began to take hold in the Austrian and Russian Empire. As a result of different influences, the sense of identity developed differently in each Ukrainian region. Moving forward, it is important to understand where Ukrainian nationalism came from, why Ukrainian sense of identity may differ, and the general situation each area found themselves in at the start of the Ukrainian Revolution. World War I will go down in history as one of the most calamitous events known to man. World War I started in part due to rising nationalism throughout Europe in the preceding decades, making it somewhat ironic that the Ukrainian states, the Ukrainian fulfillment of nationalism, and a new identity were born due to an event sparked by nationalism elsewhere. World War I brought the collapse of the Austrian, now Austro-Hungarian, and Russian Empire in 1917 and 1918. Subjugated Ukrainians now found themselves with an opportunity to forge a new nation of their own. This period is known as the Ukrainian Revolution or Ukrainian revolutions. For nearly 5 years, the Ukrainians of the East and the West sought to establish their own state through geopolitics, local alliances, internal politics, and military action. In the aftermath of Tsar Nicholas II's abdication, there was much uncertainty within the former empire. The empire was one in which only roughly half of the population was ethnically Russian, leaving half the population in a state where independence or incorporation to the new states were equally viable options. When the provincial government took power, there was recognition that regional autonomy, in theory, was allowed. The region of Ukraine being included in the regions which were eligible for autonomy. At first, there were Ukrainians who supported the provincial government. Sergei Yakoslevich, I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, forgive me, notes that one newly formed political group, the Executive Committee of United Civic Organizations, as being one of the Ukrainian groups supporting the provincial government. However, because the provincial government allowed the right to assembly after taking power from the Tsar, it did not take long for less supportive groups to come out of their underground meetings and hiding to make their own voices heard on the future of Ukraine. When the Ukrainian Central Rada formed in the third week of March, it sought to act as a central platform for all Ukrainian parties to have a voice. The provincial government initially rejected the establishment of the Ukrainian Central Rada. In return, the UNR declared independence from the provincial government. On June 10th of 1917, in their first manifesto, the UNR declared Ukrainian independence, stating, "Let Ukraine be free. The Central Russian government did not want to have our commissioner with it, did not want to create a new system with us. And now, Ukrainian people, we are forced to create our own destiny. When the provincial Russian government cannot bring order to us, when it does not want to join us in doing great work, we must take it upon ourselves. It is our duty to our land and to the people who live on our land. From now on, every village, every volst, every county or Zemstov council that stands for the interest of the Ukrainian people must have the closest organizational relations with the Central Council." In their bid for autonomy, the Ukrainian Central Rada felt it was necessary to do things on their own. The desire for those in Petrograd to the Ukrainian nationals, the desires of those in Petrograd to the Ukrainian nationals was not something which could be accepted. Though the Ukrainians did still believe in supporting the provincial government's bid for a Russian revolution. The Central Rada in Kiev went through periods of supporting the provincial government and then withdrawing the support. In their own words, quote, "We strongly oppose autonomy of Ukraine to the all-Russian Constituent Assembly. Despite wanting to be in charge of their own country, of the people, of their own people, and of their own future, the Ukrainians had a difficult time finding the correct balance between going at it on their own and remaining close to those who controlled them for over 600 years. However, as the provincial government began to lose its grip over Russia, leading to the October Revolution, this sentiment began to change. On November 7th of 1917, the Central Rada issued yet another declaration of independence in response to the October Revolution. The Ukrainian people, you, together with the fraternal peoples of Ukraine, set us to protect the rights gained through struggle, to create order, and build a lifetime on our land. and we, the Ukrainian Central Council, by your will, in the name of creating order in our country, in the name of saving the whole of Russia, announce, from now on, Ukraine becomes the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Ukrainian People's Republic, an important distinction from an autonomous region of the new Russian state. When the spring of 1918 came to be, there was a new reality for the Ukrainians. Because of harsh Bolshevik reactions to the Ukrainian response to their coup of the provisional government in October the previous year, Kiev had been taken and the Central Rada were forced from Kiev. In order to reacquire Ukraine from the Bolsheviks, the Ukrainians had to ask assistance from Germany. The resulting counter-invasion, while technically successful, spelled doom for a truly independent Ukraine. With the Great War still raging on in the West, the Austro-Hungarians, that's not how you spell Hungarians, and Germans were short on supplies. Most importantly, they were short on food. Though the Central Rada at first believed their allies would stay for a short time and then leave, this did not become to be the reality of the situation. It did not take long for the established political order to break down. By April of 1918, a coup d'etat took place and the Central Rada, which was formed to support the ideas of the February Revolution and further interest of the Ukrainian people, had collapsed. The Hetman government was a return to conservatism of the past generations, more or less under a new name. Hetman had been a member of the imperial government, and to a degree he personally served Tsar Nicholas II during World War I. He was a large landowner in Ukraine who formed a government which he tried to base on the old Cossack model from the 17th century. Despite having been placed in power with the help of the Central Powers, the Hetman did achieve national achievements. For instance, as this gentleman points out, the Hetman established diplomatic ties with about a dozen nations and attempted to negotiate the Galician region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, because the Hetman was headed mostly by former aristocrats and conservatives looking to keep the Central Powers happy, they were not as progressive they were not as progressive in other areas as the Central Rada. Having mentioned the influence of the Central Powers in Galicia and the emergence of the Ukrainian states are worth noting. At first, the Ukrainians of Galicia were no more than observers to the events going on in the newly established UNR. However, the Austro-Hungarian Empire slowly began to decline, and when it was dissolved as an entity, the Ukrainians of Galicia found themselves in a new territory. Galicia, as a whole, had sought nationalism within the Austrian and later Austro-Hungarian Empire, but in a sense were not proponents of full-fledged nationalism. Much like how the Ukrainians in the East desired autonomy from Petrograd, but until the Bolshevik coup, did not want independence. The Ukrainians in Galicia had, to a limited degree, achieved the ability to pursue national interest while having the stability of the Austrian Empire. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918, though now free to pursue national interest fully, the Ukrainians were thrust into a brand new world which was constantly changing. The night of October 31st, 1918, the Ukrainians of Galicia made their first move towards full independence. On that night, the Sikh, however you pronounce that, riflemen captured the Galician capital of Lviv. The next morning, had a Ukrainian flag flying over the city. At this point, the main threat to Ukrainian nationalism was not the Bolsheviks. Instead, it was the Poles. Ukrainian nationalism, for as long as it had existed in Galicia, was constantly in conflict with Polish nationalism. The Poles in the region were typically the landowning elite within the former Austrian province, Prior to Poland being partitioned for the first time, the Poles had enjoyed control over the native Ukrainian peasants. Now that Poland was a nation yet again, they sought no change for the power structure that was already in place. The Ukrainians in Galicia, however, now able to forge a new path, were no longer content with the Poles being the ones in charge of their lands. Though capture of Lviv was the first salvo of Western Ukrainian nationalism, it was not the pinnacle of nationalism in the ZUNR. In late November, a government was established to represent nearly 3 million Ukrainians in Galicia, based on old Austrian models. The ZUNR established order and a functioning bureaucracy. The ZUNR was able to raise an army of 100,000 soldiers, essentially turning a former imperial province of a few million people into a functioning nation. In January of 1919, Ukrainian nationalists of the Ukrainian Revolution was able to unite the two Ukraines. From now on, the centuries-old parts of Ukraine, Galicia, Bukovina, Transcarpathia, and the Dnieper Ukraine merge into one greater Ukraine, the eternal dream for which the best sons of Ukraine lived and died have come true. From now on, there is only one independent Ukrainian People's Republic. From now on, the Ukrainian people, liberated by a powerful impulse of their own forces, has the opportunity to unite all the efforts of their sons to create an indivisible, independent Ukrainian state for the good and happiness of the Ukrainian people. The realization that both states are in theory stronger together, the UNR and the ZNUR united. This was short-lived, however, due to infighting, invasion, and the situation Ukraine found itself in. The united Ukraine soon found themselves fighting French-backed Poles, whites looking to restore Tsarist institutions where possible, and the Bolsheviks in pursuit of those who they found detrimental to their revolution. The invasions of 3 different armies were one of the likely causes for the failure of the Ukrainian People's Republic. With the Russian Civil War waging on between the whites and the reds, Ukraine was a key location. Both sides wanted desperately to claim Ukraine as their own. As a result of this, Ukrainian experienced some of the most destruction and bloodshed of the war. This fighting in Ukraine divided Ukrainian forces and politicians as it became clear that the Ukrainians would have to choose between one side or another. By 1920, the Ukrainians were facing collapse, though the Russian Civil War would go on for another year after the Ukrainian Revolution ended. By the conclusion of the Civil War, the Ukrainian state was crushed. The Bolsheviks claimed most of what had once been Russian Ukraine, incorporating it into the USSR as a socialist state. Poland received Galicia, and the Ukrainians there remained under their control until World War II. When Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, when Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945, the USSR united Galicia with the Ukrainian SSR. It was not until 1991 that Ukrainians were able to have another attempt at nationalism. Though the Ukrainian Revolution failed to create a Ukrainian state, it was a complete failure. Though the Ukrainian Revolution failed to create a Ukrainian state, it was a complete failure. Okay, that's repetitive. The Ukrainian Revolution established that Ukraine could establish a state for its own people, one which was governed by their own nationalism and interests. As this gentleman, the Ukrainian Revolution forced Bolsheviks to grant Ukrainians their own SSR when they were engulfed into the USSR, which was a step in the direction of nationalism compared to what the case had been by other empires. I don't know if I entirely agree with that currently. Ukrainian nationalism has had a long and complex history. A complexity of Ukrainian nationalism that is that there have been relatively few times it has been expressed in a manner conducive to allowing it to succeed. Ukrainian nationalism was allowed to be experimented with in the mid 19th century, offering promising results and hope for the future. In the early 20th century, the idea of Ukrainian nationalism became a reality in the midst of the Russian Revolution and the aftermath of World War I. While important groundwork was laid in the years after the spring of 1948, the Ukrainians of 1917 through 1921 were unable to create a lasting state based on the previous ideas of Ukrainian nationalism. The importance of studying the past of Ukrainian nationalism is clear because of the current world events. Since the founding of an independent Ukraine in 1991, the concept of nationalism for the state and the people has been in question. Notable by Vladimir Putin of Russia, who on multiple occasions displayed a lack of recognition for Ukrainian nationalism. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a consensus that Ukraine would throw down their arms and welcome Russians into the land of blue and yellow. That, however, was not the case. Ukrainians have forged their own identity and seek to maintain their own national identity. Historically, Ukrainians have been ignored or suppressed as a people. Learning about their own history will hopefully counter the ability for others to do it in the modern day. This essay has covered a complex topic to the best of its ability. There are historians who have devoted whole books and their careers to answering the question of what is Ukrainian nationalism, through examining the developments of Ukrainian nationalism as a result of the revolutions of 1848 and the Ukrainian Revolution as a result of the February Revolution. I have sought to explain where it came from, what influenced it, and what it developed into. The Ukrainians are a proud people through nationalism for Ukraine, though nationalism for Ukrainians may have failed in the 19th and 20th century. Their sense of nationalism still persists, even in the face of invasion, political manipulation, cultural genocide. The foundations for this new nationalism seen today was laid when Ukrainians began to experiment as a subjugated people, attempting to figure out where they fit into the world as a people. Those are the sources that are listed. Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine by Anne Applebaum. Identity and Geopolitics, Ukraine's Grappling with Imperial Legacy by Jacobus Delwady. Red Victory, A History of Russian Civil War by Bruce Lincoln. The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont by Paul R. Magosi. The Russian Primary Chronicle. Okay, so that's the Tales of Bygone Years. It is unknown where the Little Russians are heading to. The autonomy dispute between the Ukrainian Central Rada and the all-Russian provincial government in 1917 by Johannes Remy. Ukraine, A History by Oris Sublintly. First Manifesto of the Central Ukrainian Rada, June 10th, 1917, by the Ukrainian National Republic. The Second Manifesto of the Ukrainian Central Rada, July 3rd, 1917, same source. Third Manifesto of the Ukrainian Central Rada, December 27th, from the same source. Act of Directory reunifying all Ukrainian lands, that is from Kiev by the Ukrainian National Republic. The Ukrainian meaning of 1918 and 1919 by Sergei Yakovlev, I don't even know. and Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation by the same gentleman. That concludes my video essay. As you saw, it is as close to word for word as I could get to what I wrote. There were points where the grammar was not the best. Like my introduction video says, I do blame that on the fact that I wrote this essay in about a 36-hour period. So there may have been times that there were oversights with grammar, spelling, punctuation, capitalization, pluralization, and also I am not the best at reading out loud. So I appreciate everybody sticking with me through this and getting through it. I will most likely be uploading a AI voiced version of this as well, just so that way it'll hopefully be a little bit more consistent with audio and reading. But I did want to put out the me version of it first. So I appreciate everybody listening, and have a good day.